and welcome to Head to Head. This is Vivica Williams. In Ukraine, finding the balance between upholding freedom of speech and withholding information for national security reasons is a difficult one. On the program today, to discuss this and more about freedom of speech and how governments can support this is Toby Mindel. He's an expert on freedom of speech, and he's the executive director of the Center for Law and Democracy in Canada. Toby, thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, great pleasure.
So tell us a little bit about the organization and the type of work it does.
Yes, so the Center for Law and Democracy, we're based in Canada, and we focus on what we call foundational rights for democracy: freedom of expression, right to information, right to access information, right to participate, freedom of association and freedom of assembly, the sort of the rights that are the pillars that on which democracy stands.
And you guys have done a ranking of countries based on their access to information, freedom of access.
Right, so we have developed what we call the RTI, Right to Information rating. We call it Right to Information because under international law, it is recognized as a fundamental human right. So the Right to Information ranking looks at the legal framework in every country in the world that's adopted an access to information law. There's about 116 countries. We have 111 on the ranking so far. It takes us a little while. This is a dynamic space, and it takes a little while to get them on there. And of course, we've ranked Ukraine. Its new law, its 2013 law, puts it in 23rd place out of the 111 countries. So pretty good law.
And it falls where compared to some other countries?
Well, I mean, the top countries are Mexico is at the very top of the ranking. Second country is Serbia, as it happens. This is just the legal framework, so it doesn't necessarily mean that the implementation is the best in the world. Interestingly, Western countries are not at the top of the ranking. Countries like Canada, the United States, even Sweden, which was the first country in the world to adopt one of these laws, they're a little bit further down, not in the top 20 even.
So it's about the ability to access the information, not necessarily how much information the country provides, or what gives us in short.
It's the rules about access to information. If they were perfectly applied, then the country would be in the same position in terms of implementation. But of course, some countries have great laws. So Ethiopia is really high up on the ranking, but they've done almost nothing to implement their law. So, you know, they're still there on the ranking because the ranking only looks at the legal framework, but it doesn't mean that the country, in fact, is flowing information properly to its citizens. It just means that they passed a great law.
All right, and so then if we look at Ukraine's access to information, and as you know, with the war we have going on here, it's been a very big problem here looking at where's that line. So, for example, we had an issue where certain websites were blocked. And these were popular social media websites that are based out of Russia. And the issue was that there's discussion about these websites being used to recruit fighters to go from Russia or other countries into the East. And so it's a social media site that's the equivalent to Facebook, but very tied to the Russian government. And so the Ukrainian government made a blanket decision to block this and some other search engine sites or other sites that are very tightly tied. So where does that line fall? And we talked a bit about that. How do you stop access to things that, you know, could lead to fighters coming to your country, help with spreading propaganda, versus allowing people free access to information?
Right. So that's always a really difficult question. And I mean, all of the national access to information laws around the world have an exception for national security. Sometimes that exception tries to elaborate what national security really means. Often it just says, you know, information about national security won't be disclosed, and then it's left to sort of decision makers later on to decide what that is.
Right.
I mean, if we look at international standards and looking at international court cases, so going beyond perhaps just the words of legislation, one of the things that they focus on is how close is the nexus between the expressive activity, whether it's access to information or it's something people are talking about, so the Facebook equivalent that you mentioned, it's an expressive activity. How close is the link between that and the threat to national security? Is it imminent, or is it kind of several steps in between, if you will.
Right,
Because
right.
if we allow the wider blocking, sort of the several steps one, we're going to be able to block a lot of speech. And that then starts to erode our democracies. And frankly speaking, when you have very sensitive situations like in this country, when popular opinion, is sort of quite strongly on one side, perhaps properly so, but still the need to protect minority voices, less popular voices is even stronger than in any other context. So I think that sort of, although of course Ukraine needs to defend its national security, and it has an absolute right to do that, but it needs also to be very, very careful that in doing so, it is not repressing free speech beyond what's really required. And that's the difficult thing to do.
And so, for example, let's take the site is called VKontakte. So it's a very popular Facebook equivalent type of site.
Right.
So instead of, you would say, instead of blocking an entire social network, this is where there needs to be this effort to request blocking of certain pages or
well, if there were particular pages on the site that were identified as being more directly linked to recruiting and it was possible to block them, certainly that would be better than blocking the whole thing. I work in Myanmar as well, and there was a case there where sort of the real Facebook was being used by Buddhist nationalists to whip up actual violence against the Muslim minority. I don't know if your viewers know much about the situation in Myanmar. There's been a lot of hostility between those two communities, spilling over into violence regularly, and the Muslim minority is a small minority and very much under attack. So at one point that was happening, and the government blocked access to Facebook altogether because they wanted to kind of prevent the violence. And then later on, they arranged to kind of get a hotline to Facebook, and so that when a particular post or activity on Facebook, they can block just that, and they don't have to take the whole thing down. That's obviously a much more free speech friendly approach. They're taking out the stuff that's really harmful without kind of cutting everything out.
And then that's a case where you talk free Facebook being an organization that is independent and responsive and has this type of situation where it does leave a country and organizations in this kind of difficult zone because certain information is more insidious and harder to pinpoint that this is this direct case tied to it. So where are some cases where you have seen where there's been a direct call to violence other than this in Myanmar, and that some action has been taken?
So there was very interesting discussion quite a long time ago. There was a massive genocide in Rwanda. I mean, it flared up very quickly, and a huge number of people were killed. It was probably the most intense genocide that ever happened. And there was a radio station that was basically directing the genocide. So they would say, there's Tutsis, so the Hutus were killing the Tutsis, and there's Tutsis in that house, go and kill them. And the radio station was actually bombed, but then it went mobile, and so then there was this sort of talk about whether it should be blocked and things. I mean, in that kind of a context, I don't think you can get into fine-tuning about, okay, now they're directing the war, but now they're just broadcasting news. I mean, I think that, that's a live, actually violent. The imminence is clear. You meet all the conditions under international law in that kind of situation. I don't know about the Russian Facebook example particularly, and perhaps it's difficult for the Ukrainians to have any influence over it. So that's another factor to take into account. But when you get into blocking whole services, I guess, I would like to see what the possibilities were and try to find a more toned or more, targeted type of intervention, blocking a whole service that's a social
and perhaps also the method in which you go about it. I mean, more public discussion, maybe more voting in Parliament, looking at the laws with the Supreme Court or something, so going through versus a presidential decree.
Okay, so I didn't know that it's a presidential decree.
So
I mean, definitely I would want to see the
changes
courts.
Right.
The courts are the president is a political actor. He's trying to get reelected and trying to kind of curry favor with his citizens, whereas the courts are not in that position. They can make more objective, more, kind of
and longer,
sober, let's say, decisions, and without outside of the glare of publicity to some extent.
Well, let's talk a bit. We're talking about that radio station, and that reminded me of the radio stations in the occupied territory in the east of Ukraine. Okay. And I attended a conference, Donbass Media Conference, a couple of weeks ago, and one of the speakers called on the radio and television broadcasting stations in the occupied areas to be bombed. This, of course, led to most of the journalists had the same reaction that you have. What would be your response to that idea?
I mean, bombing a radio station is a really extreme measure. I don't know the content that's being produced by those radio stations, so I can't kind of make a fine-tuned judgment about it. But unless they are spewing out, continuous war propaganda. I mean, war propaganda is illegal under international law. States are allowed to, in fact, they're required to ban that. The rules of international law certainly permit that. Bombing a radio station, though, is pretty extreme measure. And I don't know, but maybe these radio stations are an important vehicle for voice and information for the people living in those areas. And if so, that's an important consideration to be taken into account. They're living in the occupied territories. They also need information, about their situation, about what's going on there and whatever. So, there are freedom of expression interests that need to be carefully calibrated with responses to national security, and sort of crude measures are rarely justified. In the Rwandan case, it was a very extreme case. I mean, there was an active, massive genocide taking place, and the radio station was not just generally whipping up thing, it was actually directing the genocide. It's a very direct link,
Very obvious. So in a sense, we are left with this kind of place in the world where the amount of information is much harder to control. From the government's point of view, it's almost impossible to stem this type of propaganda, these type of attacks, where when this first information comes out, this disinformation, it's very hard, it's impossible to completely block these voices. So how should a government respond? Or you have some examples of better responses instead of to blocking disinformation or blanket responses like this?
Yes, so a couple of responses to that. I mean, one of the conditions under international law for a measure against freedom of expression to be justifiable is that it's effective. Right. You can't, stop speech if that doesn't achieve an objective that you're trying to achieve. Right. So, I mean, as you say, I mean, actors today, whether they're states or private actors, have a lot of ways of spreading information. The internet is a multifarious beast, and whether stopping the Russian Facebook really made any difference, that's an important. I don't know whether it did, but that's an important consideration. If it didn't make any difference, then there certainly wouldn't be any justification for stopping it. I think that we've always said that the best response to bad speech is more speech, and I think that has to be a very, very important in these generalized kind of creating communities of, terrorists or activists or whatever. We need to really think about that idea. Ukraine is not the only country which has been subject to Russian propaganda and disinformation. NATO, my own country, Canada, is now leading the NATO mission in Latvia, for example, and our activities there have been specifically targeted by Russian disinformation, trying to discredit the Canadian troops, telling lies about what they're doing, the way that they're interacting with the local population. I know that there were accusations, planted by Russia that German troops had raped local women, which was completely false. And NATO has responded not by trying to block the Russian, information services, but by countering that and by having quite sophisticated, systems for disseminating their own counter messages. And I think that has to be an important part of the response.
Yeah, because it's not, you become a trusted organization, you don't respond this kind of tit for tat, but you compose yourself in some type of dignity, not to, as they say, sink to that.
But also when specific allegations which are false come out, denying them.
Immediately.
Yeah,
Right.
and saying, this is not true, not kind of getting into a battle of words at that level
Right.
with the disinformation service, because
Right.
obviously we're
You're
trying
not
to
going
operate
to
on.
win.
We're just
Right.
say, immediately, and make sure that it's available and quickly and spread widely and that kind of thing.
And let's talk about the access to information. So here in Ukraine, there is an NGO called, well, I think, Доступ до правды, access to truth. And what it does is it helps people to be able to request information from the government. And this is run by an NGO. So do you think this is something that NGOs have to or be tasked with helping people to access information? Or is there other methods? Is this something the government should be more open with, or directing that access and helping citizens?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that there are a lot of responsibilities in this space. Definitely, governments have a responsibility, for example, to raise awareness among citizens, to tell citizens, hey, you have this, here's this law, you have this right, come and use it. And they also have the responsibility to process requests in a friendly way, because there's lots of small blocking actions without kind of technically breaching the law. You can slow things down, you can ask for clarifications of requests which actually are quite clear enough anyway, and you can be obstructive or you can be facilitative, and you should be required to be the latter. But it's also, I think, very important that NGOs get involved, that they do help citizens interface with the government, because it's a kind of a complicated law, and it's having NGOs do that kind of service, I think, is very useful. I wouldn't say it's their responsibility, but if you have an active NGO presence, I can say that the countries where this right has been more successful, or these laws have been implemented more successfully, is where there's kind of broad-based social involvement from a whole bunch of different players, from the media talking about the right, talking and using it, and then telling their stories and linking it back to the fact that they used the access. This story was an access to information inspired story, and we have a great story going on now in Canada, for example, where a very intrepid journalist has used the access to information law. There's the police, if they get a criminal accusation, they classify it, and one of the classifications is unfounded. They don't believe the accusation is true. And this journalist found out that across police stations in Canada, an incredible percentage of rape allegations were being classified as unfounded.
Well, the same, I think, in the U.S. having the same problem.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe she was inspired by some U.S. examples. I don't know. And I mean, that was a great story, but she linked it back to the access to information law. So people are reading the story and they know, oh, this was inspired by that law, and they learn about the law and they become aware of it. So I think the media also has a role to play. We can't sort of say it's all the government's responsibility, because they don't have the outreach. You guys touch people daily in a much bigger way than the government does, for example. So I think all kinds of actors.
And all right, well, let's talk about the idea of just in this way of just putting information out. So someone gets access to this information. Is that enough? We look at this whole world now of alternative facts, and is it enough to put the truth out? To being able to show what is the truth, of course, we talk about, but to counter this alternative facts, is it enough to have access to information, to share that information?
So I mean, now we're getting into quite complicated, almost philosophical debate. But I mean, I think we need to have democracies in the first place. Proper democracies, not managed democracies or some other form of democracy. Democracy where people actually freely elect the government, and the core idea of a democracy. We need to have trust in government. We need the whole. One of the big important benefits of an access to information law is that people, if you trust your government, which normally you should be able to do, at least that information, it comes out of government and it's real information, most of it, not 100% of it, and so it's a place of trust in the information relationship versus what a politician said or what somebody else said, which could be just spin or whatever. Government information should be reliable. So, in my country, in Canada, if you get something out of government, it doesn't mean you should blindly and absolutely trust it, but by and large, it's pretty reliable. And I think that that's an important part of solidifying the information space. Of course, there's lots of other fact-checking organizations and countering and good media. Again, sort of good investigative journalism, solid, trustworthy media, purveying the truth in a reliable and trustworthy way. And I think it's interesting in the States, there's been a real revival, I think, of people's trust in the media, almost ironically, because at the front end of the current political dispensation, there was a frontal attack on the media, but over time, I think more and more people are realizing, okay, no, actually, the media is telling the truth, and we can go there and find the truth, and they will, if they made a mistake, admit it or whatever, which doesn't happen in other spaces. So, media is a very important part of the thing. And I personally, I think public broadcasting. So there's a big discussion here.
Yeah, actually, and that would be a whole other topic for us. Is the Ukraine actually really pushing now to start its own public
service
broadcaster.
Right. Public service broadcaster.
Yes.
So we have a public broadcaster means a government or state-owned broadcaster, but a public service means an independent one that serves the people, that's not controlled by the government.
And this is
like
where
BBC.
And this is where they're going.
Yeah, right.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for all of this information today and these insights into improving access to information and use of information as well.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thanks so much for being with us. Today, we were talking with Toby Mindell, who's an expert in freedom of speech and the executive director of the Center of Law and Democracy in Canada. Thank you for watching.